November 20th, just a couple of days ago, was the annual Remembrance Day for Meister Eckhart, 13th century German mystic and theologian, who said this: "If the only prayer you ever say in your entire life is thank you, it will be enough." Gratitude, the root and the flower of a spiritual life. A daily practice for many of us, I know, and the subject of the upcoming national holiday that we will celebrate on Thursday. Now, even though this annual celebration is often accompanied by an outpouring of both intentional offerings of thanks and acts of service and compassion, we know that Thanksgiving in the United States has something of a shady past. The story of its beginnings has numerous versions. Everything from images of grateful natives accepting the generous hospitality of English settlers to accounts of prayers of thanksgiving that are raised by brutal colonizers who had conquered and murdered native tribes. Accurate reporting eludes us. But what we do know, at least in part, is that the English settlers found themselves at something of a border. The land they had, quote, discovered was occupied by those who had subdued and cultivated it for centuries. The European invaders then set out to overtake the native inhabitants. This we know. The mythology of godly pilgrims hosting docile natives is, of course, the stuff of Anglo-centric fairy tales. But somewhere along the way, after brutality and slavery and oppressive takeover, borders were crossed for at least a bit of good. We know that food was shared, that harvest and blessing were celebrated by both settlers and natives. Borders, lines that separate, chasms that divide. Borders can prevent entry, they can prevent exit, and sometimes borders signal danger. In fear of the other side of the border, human beings and nations want to close borders, don't we? We want to insulate and protect ourselves from that which might cross over the border. In our gospel lesson for today, Jesus too is at the border between Samaria and Galilee. He was crossing social and religious and political borders that separated people with attitudes of superiority and fear. Jesus was at this boundary between nations and religions, where condescension and hostility drew the line in the land. We know at least a little about the gulf that separated Jews and Samaritans. It was marked by suspicion and alienation. Samaritans, at least in their own understanding, were also, like Jews, people of the covenant. But to Jews, Samaritans were unclean, half-breeds, outcasts, other than God's people. Jesus was at the border. And there he encountered yet another border. Jesus probably heard the bells and sensed the smells that signaled their approach. Their cries crossed the border too as they shouted, "Unclean," to notify anyone of their approach. Compelled by compassion, Jesus crossed that border between Jews and Samaritans, between clean and unclean. He stepped over the boundary between insiders and outsiders. Outsiders depended on the charity of insiders for their very survival. Insiders who often turned away, refusing to touch, to look, to value. They pleaded for food and mercy, longing to be human. Jesus didn't touch them. He didn't tell them they were healed, at least not at first. He didn't ask about their faith. He didn't inquire any more than what they said about what they wanted from him. Rather, he offered them a message that was encoded in Hebrew law, which would be known to Jews and Samaritans. Go, Jesus said, show yourself to the priest. You see, the priest is the one who mediated that space between insider and outsider, between one who had leprosy and one who was healed. Only the priest could restore their place in the community, move them from outside back to inside. And so they went. The writer tells us that as they went, they were made clean. And one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back to thank Jesus. And then, as if it's in capital letters, the text says, and he was a Samaritan. Without a priest, without any declaration at all, this one declared himself restored and healed. The outsider crossed the boundary on his own without documents or official status, documented by compassion and love that made the way. At the border, when Jesus dared to cross over, when he dared to acknowledge and honor, things changed. People changed. In thanksgiving, restoration and healing take place. Relationship is formed and the boundaries are blurred. My friends, we stand on the border today. The border between this cultural and religious call to be grateful for all that we have and the world's latest horrors and cries that we hear for deepening of divisions, even at the expense of life-saving compassion. This harvest festival, this Thanksgiving, finds us at the border between lament and thanksgiving, between gratitude for all that we have and the temptation to build protective walls around ourselves to maintain our security and safety at the expense of the salvation of others. In these last months, we've been taken to the borders in Paris and Beirut, in Ferguson, in Mali, in Baltimore. These borders between nations, these borders of emotions. Messages from the church and the public square call us to turn away from the borders, to protect and cloister ourselves with ethnic surety, protect ourselves from the other who approaches our borders. As Thanksgiving collides with this day when our world is rocked by instability, unpredictable violence, and cries for help at our borders, hundreds of thousands, we know, flee their homes under threat of violence and seek safety on the other side. We could, of course, turn from the border, soothe our souls with tryptophan, settle in with cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie and a gratitude list which presumes God's continuing protection of our land and our lives, hoping beyond hope that everything can be as it was. Or we can take into ourselves the tension of this day, the tension between just settling in with things as usual and being fully in intentionally conscious of the realities of this day. There's a small cafe in Atlanta. I'm sure there must be others like this cafe all over the United States, but I don't know about them. In this cafe, called Cafe 458, the tables are set with nice dishes and cutlery. There are menus and friendly, welcoming waitstaff who greet diners with a smile. One thing is missing on the menu, though. There are no prices, because the food doesn't cost anything. In another form, you might call this place a soup kitchen, but it's not. It's a cafe at the border between homelessness and holiness, a place that reaches across the divide to fill the gulf between insiders and outsiders. You can experience it there. What happens when we step across the border? There's grace there, and dignity, and there's hope and joy, and there's continual thanksgiving. Thursday will be a high holy day at Cafe 458, a day of boundary crossing and praise. Just one example of what happens when we dare to step across. Does this Thanksgiving, with all its uncertainty, its threats and fears, somehow offer us an opportunity to give thanks in a different way? To let our gratitude open our hearts to those that we encounter at life's borders. This day of uncertainty and threat may just offer us an opportunity to see deeper, to change from insiders who expect to have enough to those who are watching for ways to reach across and offer grace. Now, I hope that we all have a beautiful Thanksgiving, that our hearts overflow with gratitude, that we're surrounded by warmth and family and friends, that we are aware of the graces and gifts in our own lives. I hope that we'll feed on the bread of justice and drink the wine of hope. And I hope that amid the rubble at this day's borders, our gratitude will reach across all that divides with love and compassion. Amen.